Let's begin lecture number 1. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 things. First, we're going to be introducing philosophy in general as a discipline, as a mode of inquiry, and as a distinctive way of engaging in that mode and engaging in that discipline. Second, we're going to talk about argumentation and good philosophical questions. These are things that are essential to the practice of philosophy as we'll be engaging in it in this course. And then finally, we're going to be talking about God and the good life itself, the structure of the class, what you'll be doing, how to turn in assignments, and that sort of thing. So here's an agenda for the day. And here are the learning objectives. I'm not always going to be posting learning objectives. I have learning objectives for every single class period, and I will make them available to you in some respect. I may email them or I might post them on Nexus. But for today, I wanted to run through the learning objectives just to give you a sense, both of what they are and what learning objectives are more generally, right? So if you're wondering, what should I be doing while you're talking in class? What should I be doing while we're in discussion? What should I be doing in small groups? This is what you should be doing. You should be acquiring the following sort of skills. You should be learning how to do the kinds of things that are listed on the current slide. Okay, so under philosophy, just learning about philosophy in general, I want you to understand at the end of this lecture what philosophy is. We're going to look in particular at 3 different sort of conceptions or notions of philosophy. We're going to see the relationship between those, but you should come away from this lecture feeling pretty confident in answering the question, what is philosophy? Right? So as soon as you log off, and if you're at your homes, if your parents come up to you and they say, well, so what are you doing, over the summer? You say, well, I'm taking a philosophy course. And they ask you, well, what is that? After today, you should be able to confidently respond to them with an answer to what philosophy is. Secondly, we're going to look at what makes for a good philosophical question. There was some great discussion of this on the Facebook page. We'll talk about that a bit. And we'll refine some of the things that came up in that discussion. We'll refine that and actually come up with a substantive account of what a good philosophical question is. I also want you to know, become familiar with, the 4 major questions that we'll be tackling in this course and how they relate to one another. So I included this under the philosophy section because I want you to encounter them as philosophical questions, to understand why they're philosophical questions, maybe why they're good philosophical questions, and to understand the relationship of the 4 questions to each other. With respect to argumentation, you got to grasp the basic point of argumentation and its role in philosophy. You should know the difference between formal and informal arguments, and you should understand how to analyze arguments in terms of their central claim, clarification, support, and objection. So some of these things are building on what you've already done in the Reason Like a Champion packet, which I have right here. And these will be things that we sort of further build on in lecture and discussion today. Finally, with respect to God and the Good Life, I want you to understand the course structure. So God and the Good Life, as I'm teaching it over the summer, is a flipped classroom. And I want you to know what that is. I want you to understand how the online component relates to the lecture, relates to the in-class time, relates to the small group. And I want you to understand very basically how to complete assignments. It looks like, for the most part, you've all been able to figure that out on Nexus, but I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page so that we're all coming in prepared to class periods. Okay, great. So let's start with the first question. What even is philosophy? I don't know why it's kind of weird there. There we go. So here's a quote. I like this quote. It's not a definition of philosophy. It's not an account of philosophy, but it kind of is on its way towards a definition or an account of philosophy. We could define it in terms of its aim, and you could think of this as expressing the aim of philosophy. And it's by Wilfrid Sellars, who was a 20th century analytic philosopher, very interesting philosopher. And sort of, if you don't know what I mean by 20th century, well, you should know what I mean by 20th century. It's like the thing where you subtract the, well, okay. but you should, so analytic philosopher, if you think like, well, what's an analytic philosopher? What makes an analytic philosopher different from any other kind of philosopher? That's something we'll talk about, in fact, in a second. But it's so it interestingly situates Sellars within a very broad sort of tradition or practice, right? We'll talk about all that, but let's get to his actual quote. What does he say about philosophy? Sellars says, the aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Under things in the broadest possible sense, I include such radically different items as not only cabbages and kings, but numbers and duties, possibilities and finger snaps, aesthetic experience, and death. Okay, I love that quote because it really gives us a sense of the scope of philosophy. A lot of you mentioned in the discussion on Facebook that philosophy aims to answer very big questions, and that's true, and we'll talk about philosophical questions in a second. But it's also true that philosophy is, in a way, wholly unrestricted in its scope, right? The kinds of questions that you ask are totally unrestricted. You can ask questions about cabbages, about kings, about finger snaps, about death, about aesthetic experience. And if you're sitting there thinking, like, what do all of those things have in common? Then congratulations, you're already doing philosophy. That's fantastic, right? Philosophy is not sort of a discipline delineated by a particular kind of question or kind of phenomena, right? It's not anthropology. We're not just asking about human behavior under a particular aspect or description. We're asking about literally all of reality. So if that's kind of daunting, it should be, because that's a hard task, but it's also exciting. It's also sort of inspiring, I think. Okay, so let's think about our question, what is philosophy? Let's break it down into three different conceptions, right? And that's what we're going to talk about first here. First of all, I want you to think of philosophy as an academic discipline. Then I want you to think of philosophy more broadly as a way of being in the world or a way of life. And third, I want you to think of it as a distinctive mode of inquiry or intellectual engagement. You're going to see that the three are related and that it's the third that we're really going to be focusing on in the class. But it helps to sort of start more narrowly, get more broad, and then understand what's common to each of these conceptions. So let's think really briefly about philosophy as a professional discipline. So if you were on campus right now, there we go, and I asked you, what is philosophy? You wouldn't be wrong if you just pointed to this particular building that I've pictured here. That's Malloy Hall. That's kind of depressing. I don't know, it's a nice building, it's fine. It's like, what, 4 stories. You wouldn't be wrong if you said, look, philosophy is what goes on in there, right? If you told me, okay, you want to know what philosophy is? Well, just, go sit in the chairs and observe what's going on. It would be an experience. But look, you would see that philosophy is what people, like the people pictured here, are engaging in, right? They're doing philosophy. And that's not a bad way of learning something about what philosophy is, right? If you wanted to know, this is an example that'll come up fairly frequently throughout the lecture. If you wanted to know what carpentry was or construction was, you might start just by showing up to a construction site, like looking around and saying like, oh, well, construction is it's what you do with all these tools. And it seems to be related somehow to building stuff, right? Infrastructure or houses. Those are the two things I know that are constructed. So it wouldn't be a bad answer, but it definitely wouldn't be a complete answer, right? We'll talk a bit about academic philosophy, about the academic discipline of philosophy and what professional philosophers do. But in this class, we're not going to be overly obsessed with that, right? So just in the same way that, you might go into a carpentry class and they would teach you the skill of carpentry, they would teach you how to do it. In this class, we're not going to be focused on the profession, right? Teaching you how to like join the American Philosophical Association, or like how to submit a paper to a conference or something like that. We're not going to focus on that so much, although it's interesting, and we can give some side notes in case we have philosophy majors amongst you, or budding philosophy majors. I can see you just like you're already thinking. You're like, oh man, after this lecture, I'm going to go declare a second major in philosophy. Actually, do we have any philosophy majors? Just raise your hand. You don't have to say anything. Justin, you're a philosophy major. Yeah, all right. Justin's a PhD student. Actually, no, he's got his PhD. Okay, good. That's great. That's great. That's good to know. Okay, so good. So we're not overly obsessed with philosophy as an academic discipline. I can talk to you much more about it, about the conventions of philosophy, about the the things that we do at conferences and how you publish things and where things are published and what it means. And we can talk about all that, but we're not going to focus on that too much throughout this semester. Something that we will focus on a bit more is philosophy as a practice or as a way of being in the world, right? Here's a broader notion of philosophy, and it's a little bit less formal than academic philosophy, right? So here's another analogy. Just like Major League Baseball isn't the only way to play baseball. And in fact, it's not even really definitional of what baseball is, right? Baseball could exist without the major leagues. If there were no professional baseball players, there could still be baseball, right? So too, academic philosophy doesn't exhaust what it is to do philosophy, right? And it's not even clear that it's essential to it or fundamental to it. And here's one way that I'll try to illustrate this. I'm going to tell you a quick story, okay? So here's story time. And it's about a guy named Plato. And actually, Plato's teacher, Socrates, who he wrote a lot about. So if you've Googled around, if you Googled philosophy before this class, you've likely encountered three big names: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, right? A lot of people sort of trace the philosophical tradition, at least in the West, back to these three thinkers. There are what we call the pre-Socratics, so philosophers who came before Socrates. You can tell a lot about what we think about them by the fact that we call them pre-Socratics, right? They're like just the people that were like there before Socrates. But really, Socrates is kind of the fountainhead of the Western intellectual tradition or philosophical tradition. And Socrates didn't actually write anything down at all, right? Socrates went around asking questions, philosophical questions, good philosophical questions, of the citizens of Athens, right, Justin? Athens. I just blanked. I should have Wikipedia. The citizens of Athens, right? So he's a Greek philosopher. He went around asking these questions to the citizens of Athens, and his whole point was to try to understand philosophically the world around him. Just wanted to understand what was going on in the world, right? Now, he had a student, Plato, and what we know of Socrates comes directly through Plato's writings, Plato's dialogues. You've probably heard of these. There's the Republic, that's the big famous one. And then there's like a billion others, the Apology, the Theaetetus, there's just like a million of these, right? And these dialogues are basically the philosophy of Socrates, except written out as if it were like a play, right? If you read the dialogues of Plato, you'll see like Socrates enters, and then Socrates says, Thrasymachus, what is justice? And then Thrasymachus is like, well, Socrates, so it's like a play, right? There's like different parts and you're reading the different parts. And what we know of Socrates' philosophy comes directly through Plato, right? Plato wrote these things down. Now the dialogues, there's some sort of historical debate. We don't know how much of the dialogues are actually Plato's philosophy, how much is just like Socrates' philosophy, et cetera. That's a complex historical question, very interesting. We're not going to get into it too much here. But that's how we know about Socrates and about what Socrates did. Okay, so, I should mention too, Plato had a student, you may have heard of him, Aristotle, super famous philosopher. We'll talk about Aristotle later. But here's the story. Okay, so here's the story. So Socrates would walk around Athens and he would basically encounter somebody who claimed or purported to know something, right? And Socrates was very famous in claiming that he himself knew nothing, right? We call this Socratic ignorance. It's a kind of skepticism. It's a kind of refusal to believe without, a pretty high standard of evidence. So Socrates would walk around and he would say, oh, I know nothing. I know nothing except for the fact that I know nothing, right? That's like one of these really annoying philosopher moves. When you become a philosopher, you can tell your parents that. You can be like, oh, I'm so Socratically ignorant. I don't know anything, but that I don't know anything. And they'll just be like, get a job. Sorry, this is like biographical. Okay, so that's what Socrates did. And Socrates actually refused to become what we would recognize as a professional philosopher. There were professional philosophers, but these were people who would basically take on students and teach them how to win arguments, right? So students would come to them and they'd say, hey, I want to be a politician. Athens is a democracy, and so the politicians have all the power, and so I want to learn how to make persuasive arguments, right? And these people, they were called rhetoricians, because they taught rhetoric, or they were called sophists, more pejoratively. They would take them in and they would say, okay, yeah, great, just for, 10 easy payments of like 499 Greek shillings. That's not the right word for Greek currency. Anyway, I will teach you how to persuade people and win arguments. And Socrates thought, this is disgusting. He thought this is despicable, right? He probably would have thought the same thing about what I'm doing right now. I mean, you guys are literally paying me and I'm teaching you how to argue well. So he probably would have looked at me and be like, oh, what is this sophist doing? Like, man. And then he would have asked me questions out of Socratic ignorance in an attempt to embarrass and undermine me. It probably would have worked. He was a smart guy. But so this is what he did. So he would walk around to people who were either sophists or who were trained by sophists, and he would say, well, look, you say that you understand what justice is, okay? So give me an account. What is justice, right? And the person would say, well, justice, that's easy, okay? Justice is, whatever is in the interest of the strong. I don't know, some of these definitions that you find in the, the Socratic dialogues, you're thinking like really? People thought that? But no, they would say, yeah, look, whoever's stronger and whatever their will is, that's what's just, right? And then Socrates goes, whoa, wait a second. So justice is whatever's in the interest of the strong. But wait, what about a case where you have an evil tyrant who comes to power and has all these base desires and enacts those on an entire nation? Are you saying that the evil tyrant's desires are just? Then the person would be like, oh, well, and then they're back off again. They go, oh, well, no. What I meant was justice is whatever's in the interest of the strong, so long as it's in the interest of the community, or something like that, right? Some definition that built all this. And then Socrates would be like, oh, well, okay, but what if you had a whole community that's interests were base and disgusting and vile, right? It's a whole community. So you have the strong leader who's doing what's in the interest of this community, but that's a horrible thing, right? What if you have a corrupt state? And then the person would be like, usually actually at this point in the Socratic dialogues, they go, oh, Socrates, I have to be at the market. And they walk off, and they're clearly embarrassed. And then Socrates ends the dialogue being like, I still know nothing, but that I know nothing. And then you end the scene and it's very dramatic. And so that's basically how all of the Platonic dialogues go. Okay, so all of this is just to say, Socrates probably wouldn't have considered himself a professional philosopher, an academic philosopher, a member of an academic discipline, had such a thing existed in the way that it exists here. And yet, he was engaged in philosophy. Philosophy for Socrates was a way of being, a way of life, right? And in fact, I don't want to spoil anything, but the end of Socrates' life is that he was actually killed for doing this, right? People found it so destabilizing to the state. They found it so corrupting to the youth of Athens who would walk around after talking to Socrates and say things like, well, people don't really know what loyalty or justice or truth is, so we need to figure this out, And this was very destabilizing to the state, right? And so they literally killed Socrates for doing this. There's a beautiful dialogue about it that we're going to read. It's called The Apology. It's about Socrates' last moments. There's some hilarious moments in there too. But that's sort of how his whole life ended. His entire life was devoted to philosophy as just a way of being in the world, a way of engaging, right? Now, I got a quote here from Plato. Let me see here, pull it up. Okay, so this is from the Apology. So he's quoting Socrates. And here is what Socrates says. Yerp. Okay, you see it on the screen. Yep. Socrates says, I say that to talk every day about virtue and the other things about which you hear me talking and examining myself and others is the greatest good to man, and that the examined life is not worth living. That's an insanely strong statement. That is crazy, right? Socrates is saying here that our whole purpose, our whole function of being in the world is to live an examined life, to try to figure out who we are and who we are in relation to something like ultimate reality. That's crazy, right? But I gotta say, he really I don't know, ponied up, I guess is an expression that maybe somebody in poker would use. And he literally died for this, right? Socrates was like the Jesus of philosophy. That's a weird thing to say. I'll probably edit it out. That's okay. But there it is, okay? So for some philosophers, philosophy is an entire way of life, okay? Now, we're not gonna expect you in this class to die for philosophy or anything like that. That's crazy. We're not going to expect you to just engage in philosophy as a way of life from the outset. You might find that you think, philosophy, this is really interesting, this is illuminating, this is really helpful. I want to practice some of these things in my everyday life. But from the outset, we want to do something much more basic, right? And this is where we'll talk for a couple of minutes about the third way of thinking about philosophy. And that is as a mode of, I gotta go back in here, as a mode of inquiry or a relationship to the truth, right? A distinctive intellectual activity. Okay, there we go. If you're wondering what this picture is, you should Google around, see if you can find it after class. No, I'll just tell you. Okay, so at the end of the Paradiso by Dante, we get like the whole sort of poem has been working up to this one moment where Dante is able to like look upon truth itself, beauty itself, God itself, and it's this tiny like dot of light like off in the distance, surrounded by angels. It's amazing. But you can think of that as sort of what philosophy is aiming at, right? It's aiming at an encounter with reality or truth, right? And that's what we're going to explore here in sort of a little bit of detail. Okay. So think first about the etymology of the word philosophy. Okay, philosophy literally means, in Greek, broken up into two different parts, philo, Sophia, okay? Philo means love of, Sophia means wisdom. So you can think of philosophy as the love of wisdom. In that mode, you might think of philosophy as more like a relationship to some abstract entity or ideal. It's almost like a religion, although that's a very controversial statement. It's not exactly a religion, especially because there's no sort of dogma about like the divine or anything like that built into philosophy. It's more just a disposition towards the truth, okay? So here's how this is the definition of philosophy we're gonna be operating with throughout the semester. Taking notes, this would be a good thing to write down in your notes. Philosophy is the intellectual activity of pursuing the truth through careful questioning and good argumentation, right? We got 4 parts there: intellectual activity, pursuing the truth, careful questioning, good argumentation. We're gonna be talking in a second about careful questioning and good argumentation. Those are the ways that you do philosophy. That's the how of philosophy. So if you break up philosophy or the questions into the what, the how, and the why. The how is through careful questioning and good argumentation. The what is the intellectual activity of pursuing the truth then, right? What is philosophy? Well, it's this intellectual activity. It's a reflective, conscious activity of pursuing the truth. And then if you think about the why of doing philosophy, why do philosophy? Well, you got to think that the truth is valuable. I bet that's something you all are already committed to in some capacity. Maybe you aren't explicitly committed to it, or maybe you aren't committed to it absolutely. We can talk about that in a bit. But that's kind of the why of philosophy. So really quickly, this is like a maximally uninformative infographic, but I'm going to talk about it for a second because, I made it and it's a slide. And so here's what I'm thinking. Okay, so if you look at academic philosophy, right, the sphere of academic philosophy is represented by the circle on the left. If you think about philosophy as a way of life, that's represented by the circle on the right. These overlap. You might have philosophers who are professional academics, but also see philosophy as a way of life. As a matter of fact, I am one such person. I bet many professional philosophers are. So I exist in the intersection of the two circles. I exist in that little area. And thinking about philosophy as a mode of inquiry, which is the definition we're using for this class, is to think about it as the activity that's engaged in, that's characteristic of, or essential to philosophy as it exists in those spheres or any sphere, right? So philosophy for us, what we're going to be thinking of it as is a distinctive mode of intellectual engagement or a distinctive mode of inquiry. Oh, we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, stop sharing that. First, I want to do one last thing. So we talked about the what of philosophy. We talked about the why of philosophy, the how of philosophy. I just want to talk really briefly about the why of philosophy, okay? In the Reason Like a Champion packet that you have, and that's kind of washed out, you got to see it, and that you've read for today, the whole first section is really devoted to the why of doing philosophy, right? We talked about there's arguments everywhere. It's good to be able to engage in them. You don't want to be like manipulated or taken advantage of because somebody gives you an argument that you can't respond to. Also, it can help you get into law school. Philosophers have like the best like standardized test scores for like grad school of any discipline ever on the face of the planet for all of history. I said it. So anyway, so if you're thinking about going to law school, med school, anything like that, philosophy is good. Those are instrumental reasons though, right? Those are instrumental reasons why philosophy might be good, why it might be good for you to learn philosophy. Just thought, instrumental reasons isn't a very intuitive phrase. And so I will explain it to you now. An instrumental reason is a reason to do something because there's some further good that you're seeking or attaining, right? So getting a car for most people is an instrumental good, right? I get a car, why? Well, because I want to drive to work. And actually, driving to work, going to work is an instrumental good. Why? Well, because I want to make money. Well, why is money good? Well, because I want to support a family. Then you might think, well, so why is having a family good? You might think, well, look, that thing, that's an ultimate good, right? So we can distinguish between instrumental and ultimate goods. All right, that was hand wavy. I literally just waved my hands, but you can talk to me afterwards about that. All I want to do for right now is I want to say, look, philosophy might be more than merely instrumentally good. Now I'm wagging my finger. Oh my gosh. Okay. It might be more than instrumentally good. It also might be ultimately valuable or ultimately good. Okay. And now I'm going to read this quote from Aristotle. I always tear up when I read this quote. It's a beautiful quote. And here it is. Here it is. If happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, something Aristotle argues for in all of Nicomachean Ethics, some of which we'll read. If happiness is activity in accord with virtue, it is reasonable that it should be in accordance with the highest virtue. And this will be that of the best thing in us, whether it be reason or something else that is this element, which is thought to be our natural ruler and guide, and to take our thought of things noble and divine, whether it be itself also divine, or only the most divine element in us, the activity of this in accordance with its proper virtue will be perfect happiness. This activity, Aristotle claims, consists in contemplating truth. Okay, so think about that for just 1 second. The syntax was insane because Aristotle, but look, think about this for 1 second. Aristotle is claiming, look, he's saying happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, right? Think about virtue as excellence. The excellence of the human person is to act in accord, happiness for the human person is to act in accord with what characteristically makes us excellent, right? And so he is saying that happiness consists in activity in accordance with the highest virtue. And what is the highest virtue, the most divine thing that humans can ever aspire to? Contemplating the truth. And that is just exactly the aim or the end of philosophy as we've defined it for the purposes of this class. So if you want one like catchphrase, one takeaway for the whole semester about why you should care about philosophy and why you should care about God and the good life, it's just this. If you want to be happy, you have to learn how to contemplate the truth. Okay, that's a philosophical claim. You might ultimately disagree with it, right? But it's one substantive philosophical claim, and we're going to take it very seriously throughout this class. So if you're ever like slacking off, I'm just going to be like, guys, don't you want to be happy? And you're going to be like, anyway, sorry, you don't sound like that. I've never heard what you sound like. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what makes for good argumentation. We're going to speed things along because I am a bit behind on my schedule here. Okay, so here's a short answer. Here's a short answer for what makes for good argumentation. Good argumentation is just argumentation that happens in response to good philosophical questions. Arguments that clearly articulate plausible answers to good philosophical questions. And what are good philosophical questions? Well, that's a good philosophical question itself. And I'm going to jump to one right here. Here we go. So we all talked about this on the Facebook group. Can you all still see me? Justin, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Suddenly my screen just went, now I just see a big picture of myself, which is fine as long as you can see me too. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone can still hear me and is still here.
I can see little thumbnail you, Paul.
Okay, sounds good. But everybody is still in class.
As far as I can tell, yes.
Okay, good. It's sort of weird teaching online. Yeah, there we go. It's sort of weird teaching online because in that moment, it was as if the entire class just disappeared. It's like disconcerting, you know? David Copperfield. Okay, what makes for a good philosophical question? Here's the answer, okay? So we were all talking about this on the Facebook group, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about engaging the Facebook group and things like that. You guys did a fantastic job. Put some really good answers up there, but here's the right answer. Okay, so I was asking you for what makes a good philosophical question, and here's the right answer. Good philosophical questions are extremely conceptually clear. They aim to uncover interesting and important truths, and they move us forward in thinking through or reasoning about philosophical puzzles or problems. Okay, again, put this in your notes. If you're taking notes, you should be taking notes. That is what makes for a good philosophical question. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of good philosophical questions, just really briefly, and I'm running through a lot of things because I want to make sure that we get to all of our content. So here are three quick examples of good philosophical questions, okay? The first one is what we might call the problem of free will and responsibility. And it is the following question. How free must an agent be in acting in order to be responsible for her action and its consequences? If you're having trouble getting into the question, think about it in these terms. When somebody acts in a particular way, and we resent them for acting in that way, right? Say somebody comes up to you and just like slaps you in the face and takes your apple and like walks away, and you think like, hey, that was my apple, man. Like, what are you doing, you know? And then, so imagine that's the scenario. But then imagine you find out that an evil scientist had implanted a chip in their brain so that whenever they saw an apple, they slapped whoever had it and took it and walked off, right? You suddenly would think, oh, well, you can't blame them, right? You could blame the scientist maybe, but you can't blame them, right? So it seems like freedom, the ability to act freely, is essential to our holding people responsible. One way of holding people responsible is by blaming them, right? So it seems like you have to be free in order to be responsible, but how free do you have to be in order to be responsible, right? And that's our question there. How free must an agent be in acting in order to be responsible for her action and its consequences? From there, there's like a billion interesting philosophical questions, right? You might ask, okay, so how free must you be in acting? Well, what does freedom consist in? How free are we actually? Like, how plausible is it that we're actually free, given the fact that our brain is made up of all these physical parts? And like, if you manipulate parts of our brain, you can manipulate parts of our body. So if they're just like physical, like atoms interacting in our brain and neurons and stuff like that, well, how could we ever think? Okay, so you can just go down the whole rabbit hole, right? But at the sort of beginning of the rabbit hole, the sign on that rabbit hole is just that question that we asked. How free must the agent be in acting in order to be responsible for her action and its consequences? Okay, example number 1. Example number 2. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God exist given the abundance of horrendous evils that God could have prevented? That's what we call the problem of evil. We'll talk about that directly in this class. That's another good philosophical question, partly because, again, it's maximally conceptually clear, or it's extremely conceptually clear, right? It's not just asking like, how can God exist given bad stuff? No, it's like, okay, well, let's define God. Well, why is it even a problem? Well, because God has these properties. He's all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful. If God exists, how could such a being exist in the face of horrendous evil? Finally, we have, and I just want to give this one as a third sort of interesting question because it's different from the other two, right? So one thing a lot of people said in the Facebook comments was good philosophical questions have to be big questions. They have to be about things that are meaningful for everyone's life in every circumstance. And that's, it's true that a lot of the paradigms of good philosophical questions are like that. But not all good philosophical questions are like that in the same way, and not all philosophical questions that are good even have that property. So here's an example of a good philosophical question. I know a lot of people writing dissertations about this right now, and yet, you know, it's a precise, interesting question that helps move us forward. Here it is. It's called the special composition question. Under what circumstances or in what conditions do two objects compose a third? I'll let you think about that for a second. Under what circumstances or in what conditions do two objects compose a third? Okay, so clearly, if I have two pieces of clay and I like smush them together and roll them up into a ball, now I have one object, right? I had two parts. Now I have a whole. I should have brought clay. Okay, so we have one thing. So what is it about the two parts being in some sort of relationship to each other that makes it such that there's now one object, that it composes one whole, right? It's what we call a mereological question. It's a question about parthood, the relationship between parts and wholes. Wholes, W-H-O-L-E, something like that. It's a really good question. It's a really interesting question, even though it's very, very narrow, right? It's very particular. And it's not even clear that it really is relevant to anyone's life. I mean, you know, other than the people writing dissertations about it. But, you know, maybe like down the line it will be, or it'll lead to good questions that will be immediately relevant. But it's not itself immediately relevant. Okay. So we've talked about good philosophical questions. Let's talk a little bit about good philosophical arguments. I'm just going to give you three properties of them. You also read in the RLAC packet, you read on page 15 about the gold standard for arguments, in quotes, logical validity, soundness, informativeness. All I'll say, because we're going to talk a lot in the next couple of classes about this, is that when we're looking at arguments, good philosophical arguments, we're looking at the form, the logical form or structure of the reasoning, right? So we want them to be constructed logically in a way that possesses a good logical form or a good logical structure. And we want them to be directed at interesting and important truths. And the argument should assume as little as possible in order to persuade as many people as possible. Okay, so like I said, we're going to talk a lot more about that both in our discussion and then over the next 2 class periods. But let's put a pin in that one for now. And just talk really briefly about God and the Good Life. Okay, so what is God and the Good Life? First off, it's an introduction to philosophy. It's a chance for you all to reflect deeply and in a philosophical way on the 4 questions around which the course is organized. Let me just put these up on the board. There we go. So you saw this when you went and looked at the syllabus, but I'm going to put them up here now. God and the Good Life is organized around the following 4 questions. The epistemic question, what should you believe and why? The ethical question, what are your moral obligations? The metaphysical question, does God exist? Do religions accurately picture the world? And the value theoretic question, what are the sources of meaning and value in life? So I take it these are all really good philosophical questions. They're not quite in a good philosophical form yet. They're not extremely clear or precise, I guess. We can definitely make them more precise, and we will. But these are the big picture themes of the course. These are the big picture questions that we'll be talking about. The course learning objectives, which I don't have a slide for, but the course learning objectives, I do want to highlight these. These are also in the syllabus, but they're to help you learn how to closely read philosophical texts and analyze their key arguments. So throughout the course, we're actually going to look at a bunch of philosophy texts, right? We'll look at Plato's Republic. I don't know how much of that we'll look at, but we'll look at some of it. Descartes' Meditations, right? We won't look at this book, Anscombe's Intention, but it's the best book. Like, that sentence just ended, people. It's the best book. I know. Intrigued? Get a copy. I don't get like a commission or anything. It's just, it is the best book. And I'll tell you why later. But Nicomachean Ethics, second best book. Justin, don't tell anybody in the department I said those things. It's true though. We're going to look at those things and you're going to learn how to get things out of them, right? Just learn how to closely read the philosophical text, analyze their arguments. You're going to closely read essays in major news publications, mostly just the New York Times, because that's the one I have a subscription to. And so I got a bunch of content from there that I'm going to have you guys look at. You're going to learn to read those essays in major news publications and analyze their key arguments. And you're going to learn to explain and defend your core philosophical beliefs in argumentative prose and verbal exchanges. You're going to acquire these skills by completing assignments inside and outside of the course. The summer session is a flipped classroom, like I said at the beginning. What does that mean? It means you're actually going to be getting most of the content of the course outside of this live class meeting. Today's lecture is an anomaly insofar as I've been talking a lot. And throughout the semester, I'm going to talk 10, 15, 20 minutes max. And you're mostly going to be getting the content of the course in course readings, in assignments, and things that are posted on Nexus. Okay. I've designed a number of assignments to help equip you to do the things that I've listed in the learning objectives. There's reflection journal entries, daily questions, in-class debates, group assignments, op-ed assignments, and a final reflection paper. We'll talk about the details of those in a second once we sort of end the recorded session. But I will note that everything's available via Nexus, and you need to keep up with those assignments there. So there's various ways in which you can access course content, right? I'm going to be posting to a general Facebook page, not one that you guys have added yourselves to. I'm going to be posting content to a general Facebook page. It's kind of a public-facing thing. There's a couple of documents that list various assignments. All of those things are good, and they can help you like organize and manage your time, et cetera. But know that everything on Nexus, that's authoritative. So if it says do this in Nexus, you got to do that. Otherwise, you're missing points. Okay, good. Great. So now I'm going to do the thing that I said I was going to do at the beginning. So stay tuned. Don't leave. But here we go. Wait for it. Wait for it. This concludes lecture number 1.